César Dugast. I work for Carbon 4, which is a French consultancy specialized in climate change. And I'm the manager of the carbon neutrality practice there. And we help basically companies try to decarbonize in line with the global net zero target.
So could you tell us what does net zero mean exactly?
Net zero is defined by climate science as the balance between anthropogenic, which means human-induced emissions, and anthropogenic sinks. So basically, you need to balance what you put into the atmosphere every year with what you remove from the atmosphere every year, so that there is no net addition of CO2 into the atmosphere. And it is the necessary condition to stabilize the temperature at a global level. It's like you have a bathtub in your bathroom, and so the emissions are the tap, the sinks are, the siphon, and so the goal is for you not to make the bathtub overflow, which means not to exceed a certain amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, so that you can stay below 2 degrees or 1.5. And the necessary condition to reach that is to balance the tap and the sink. And so it means that to get to net zero, you mean both to close the tap as much as possible, which is to cut emissions as quickly as possible, and at the same time to develop your sink so that lots of CO2 flows out of the atmosphere every year. And so this carbon neutrality or net zero target, you need to do it fast enough so that the bathtub does not overflow, which means fast enough not to exceed the 2 degree or 1.5 degree goal.
Okay. And could you tell us why we choose 2050 as a target?
Because 2050 is the date at which it is acceptable to reach carbon neutrality, so that you do not put too much CO2 into the atmosphere. If you wait a bit, if you wait too much, for example, if you wait until 2070 to get to carbon neutrality, you will exceed a bit the amount of CO2 you put into the atmosphere, and then you get to 2 degrees. So to get to the 1.5 degree, you really need to get to net zero at 2050.
Okay. So you said we needed the sink to take off the emissions. So can we use offsetting to do that? And could you define what it is exactly?
So a carbon sink, well, offsetting, I prefer to use that word when we talk about a company. At a global level, I'd rather talk about carbon sinks or sequestration. So it's basically everything that will take CO2 from the atmosphere and store it more or less permanently into something else. For example, well, first of all, you have to know that you have two different kinds of sinks. You have the sinks that humans own and the sinks that humans do not own. What humans do not own or control, for example, are the oceans or the non-managed land, for example, very remote forests like boreal forest and so on, Siberian forest. These sinks do remove CO2, but we do not look at them when it comes to getting to net zero, because in the definition of net zero, we really want that human societies clean their own mess, which means everything, all the things that we put into the atmosphere, we need ourselves to remove them. So we do not talk about oceans or anything. So we focus on human-managed sinks. And in this category, you have two subcategories. You have the natural sinks, forests, soils, and so on. And you have the technological sinks, which means everything that humans do to take CO2 from the atmosphere. These technologies are not here today, or they are here like as prototypes, and they are not efficient at all. They are really expensive. It takes lots of problems. But basically, the idea is that you take like big machines that cost a lot of money and consume a lot of energy, and you take the CO2 and you store it permanently under your feet, actually. Today, when we talk about carbon sinks, it's basically always nature-based carbon sinks. So the growth of forests, for example, or the good agricultural practices that store lots of CO2 into the soil. These are the only options we have at that point.
Okay. And so a lot of countries have pledged to become carbon neutral. Does it make sense to become carbon neutral at the level of a country or worldwide? What do you think about that?
Well, to answer your question, we really need to understand that when it comes to judging whether a net zero target is relevant or not, you need to ask yourself, does it transform enough the object that wishes to become net zero? For example, if the planet wants to become net zero, you have no choice but cut your emissions by, I don't know, 6 or 7 times, right? Because you don't have an infinite amount of sinks. You know, the forests do not grow until the infinity. So you really need to cut your emissions, which is to turn off the tap. When it comes to a country, it's a bit the same, because if a country wants to become net zero, which means balance emissions and sinks inside the territory, it has no choice but cut really rapidly its emissions. For example, in France, the Stratégie Nationale Bas Carbone, SNBC, aims to get to net zero in 2050. But since we do not have like lots of forests or lots of agricultural soils, the best we can do is double our carbon sinks, right? So basically, you need to get from minus 40 million tons of CO2 sequestered every year to minus 80. And so in reverse, you know that net zero in 2050 must be 80 million tons of CO2 that you need to emit in order to balance with the sinks. So this means that you have to cut by 6 or 7 French emissions. So to answer your question, yes, it is really relevant to get to net zero at a national level, because this is transformative enough.
Okay, and so here when you're talking about net zero, are you talking about carbon footprints or national emissions? And maybe can you remind us what's the difference between the two?
So when you look at a country, since it is just a small fraction of the whole world, you have basically 2 ways of counting carbon. The first way is you just look at the territory and you look at everything that gets emitted or removed in that territory. For example, the SNBC is basically looking just as your national emissions. This is called inventory emissions because you just make the inventory of everything that happens inside your territory. But you have another way of seeing things, which is you can say, okay, I have a territory, but I also import a lot of goods and services. And so the carbon footprint is basically counting also what you import, minus what you export. So these 2 ways of seeing things are complementary. When it comes to defining net zero, we usually deal with inventory, but we really need not to forget your imported emissions. So both are really important.
Okay, maybe I have just a final question. We're really talking a lot about emitting 2 tons per person in 2050. What does that mean? What is this objective? And is it in terms of carbon footprint or in terms of national emissions?
So it's a really intuitive way of understanding how big and how challenging the global net zero target is to translate it at the individual level. So basically, here in France, for example, every year an average person emits 10 or 11 tons of CO2 per year. It's a carbon footprint, so you also count what you import. And we know that in order to get to net zero in 2050, you need to cut your emissions by 80%, which means to reach 2 tons of CO2 per year and per person. How do you calculate that? Well, you take the 2-degree or 1.5 carbon budget at a global scale without looking at the sinks, just emissions. And then you divide it by the amount of people that will live on the Earth in 2050. And the result is that every Earth person will have to to emit at maximum 2 tons of CO2 per year.
Okay, so now that we've talked about national and countries' emissions, I would like to deep dive into companies' emission. And my question is it possible to be 100% net zero for a company? And what does that mean?
Well, it depends on who's answering the question. I mean, some people would tell you, yeah, of course, it's possible to get to net zero. You just need to offset your emissions. And good news, you can do it like tomorrow or maybe even today. If you have a good bank account, you can purchase a lot of carbon offsets. And I can certify you, I have a stamp, I have a standard, and I can certify you that you are going to be carbon neutral tomorrow. So people can say that, some people. Other people can say, of course not. Company can never be carbon neutral or net zero because every company has an impact, and it would be like really strange to communicate on carbon neutrality when you're a company, especially when you have not asked yourselves the very important questions, which are how to reduce your emissions, for example, how to transform yourself to become compatible with a net zero planet, for example. So bottom line is that it depends on who's defining net zero. And there is a huge battle on how to define net zero at the scale of companies. You have greenwashers that want you to believe that it's possible thanks to carbon offsets. Others that prefer not to talk about net zero for companies, but rather to ask themselves, what is a company that is compatible with a net zero planet? And I tend to be on the second team because I think it's much more efficient that companies just ask this kind of questions, because it's much more efficient for them to reinvent their business models and cut their emissions.
So what you're saying is that it's completely possible to keep the same level of emissions and tell everybody that you're net zero because you're just buying as much credits as what you're emitting and just not making any difference in your strategy.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a weak definition of net zero or carbon neutrality for companies for the last several years. And this definition is basically telling you, okay, you need to measure your emissions, and then you can just offset them. Offsetting means buying carbon offsets, which means paying someone else to reduce their own emissions instead of yourself. You have lots of problems with that definition. And one of the problems is that, of course, given the fact that it's a subtraction, it's like your emissions minus your offsetting, if you continue continuously to grow your emissions, but also continuously buy carbon offsets, whether cheap or not cheap, well, it makes zero in the end. So basically, you could live in a world where all companies are carbon neutral every year, and in the end, if in 2050, have warmed the planet by 8 degrees or 4, well, at the end of the century. So this definition is really weak, and it's really time to shift to a much more robust one.
Okay, so you're saying that carbon neutrality cannot be defined at the level of a company, basically.
Well, I tend to say that. Some others tend to say that it's still possible, but only in long term, like in 2050, until you have reduced your emissions by 90% and in parallel balanced it with carbon sinks. So, it's just a question of how you define the word, but maybe the most interesting topic is what do we want companies to do? I mean, apart from the claim itself, it's like, what do we need companies to do from now to 2050? And the answer is really simple. It's cut your emissions, all of your emissions, like in your whole scope of emissions, cut them by 90% in 30 years, and in parallel of that, develop carbon sinks by paying people that know how to do it outside of your value chain. And in addition to that, you can put in the market low carbon products and services that help your customers reduce their emissions. So basically, this is really what companies should do in order to be in line with the net zero goal.
Okay, and so what can consumers do to make sure they're not being greenwashed by their company and identify a good company from a poor strategy?
Yeah, the radar for greenwashing is really it's really the same answer. Is you really need to ask yourself, okay, this company is claiming net zero, like either now or in 30 years. The question you need to ask is, does it have a plan to transform its business model, which means what the company does, in order to be compatible with a world where there are no fossil fuels at all? Yeah, lots of companies like fail, do not pass this test, because you can really quickly understand that lots of companies that claim carbon neutrality or so on will never change a bit of what they do. They will just take offsetting or so on. So I think it's quite a powerful question. Like, this bank that claims to be carbon neutral now, does this mean that it has stopped investing in in fossil fuels? Like, almost 100% of the time, it's no. Same with car manufacturers. If this car manufacturer has pledged to become net zero in 2050, does it mean that it's going to just sell electric vehicles, bikes, and hydrogen trucks? Well, the answer is still no, like in a huge amount of times. So I think it's really important to ask yourself this question.
We've been talking a lot about net zero, and to be able to even measure that, you need to have an accountability that enables you to measure it. So how do we measure emissions today, and is there an international standard, or like can anybody measure as it wants to?
Okay, so in order for a company to measure its emissions, you have standards around. You have, for example, the ISO that has a standard for counting carbon into the value chain of companies. You also have private standards like the GHG protocol that help you do it. In France, you have the bilan carbone, etc. And basically what these standards allow you to do is to really have a clear idea of what you should count in and where. For example, you have to count the company's heating system, you have to count the company's buildings and use phase of products sold and procurement and let's say the commuting of the employees and so on. So this is the theory. Okay, so you have good standards that are here that help companies measure 100% of their emissions. And then comes the fun part, which means that lots of companies, in order to elaborate their carbon strategy or climate strategy, decide just to keep one small scope of it and decide to do anything they can, everything they can to reduce this scope. For example, you have a big French bank, I will not say its name, that has recently in the last years declared that it has reached carbon neutrality. Incredible, right? Not that much, because actually when you look at the carbon neutrality pledge, you understand that this bank, which finances lots of fossil fuel infrastructure around the world, defines its carbon neutrality just on what we call the scope 1, which is just offices. So basically what it does is take like the electricity of the computers of its employees, pay someone else to offset these emissions, which are really tiny, like even less than 0.1% of the whole emissions. And they then say, okay, I'm carbon neutral. I've made it's done. My job is done. So practically, companies do not always look at their whole carbon footprint. And this is a problem. But this also needs to be addressed with stronger standards.
Okay, so what you're saying is that governments and law has a strong responsibility in like adding measures that will force companies to take into account the right perimeter of their impacts.
Of course. Well, actually, I think regulation has lots of things to do in order to tackle climate change, right? Because it's been years that there's been a proliferation of standards, of voluntary standards, right? Like it's the private sector that decides to create their own standard, their own frameworks for climate. And so it could be seen as a good news because they try to do stuff more than states do. But on the other hand, they're just creating their own rules. So it might not be enough to tackle climate change, to say the least. There is a good example on that. You know, the aviation industry has developed a system to become net zero. It's called CORSIA. What it basically says is, okay, the aviation sector needs to multiply by 4 its demand in the next 30 years. So we have to have 4 more people in 30 years taking the plane than now. This is not negotiable. It's like our business plan. And so in order to fight climate change, we decide that all this growth is going to be carbon neutral. Well, it means that they will pay offsets from now to in 30 years to neutralize the growth. And they do that because the regulation, the law, national governments failed to regulate them, failed to put laws in place and enforce laws to tackle the growth of the aviation sector, you know? So I think it's a good example of how deceptive voluntary measures can be and how it can delay climate action because it could prevent governments from taking strong action. Because it's so easy for an aviation company to say, look, I don't need to be regulated because I already have my own system, which is really efficient. So, of course, law and regulation have, a big role to play in that.
Talking about aviation, you said they're going to offset everything, but they're also talking about hydrogen planes and stuff like that. Is it realistic to think about that, or?
The problem with net zero pledges like net zero aviation, net zero transportation sector and so on, is that they always have a mindset that is really individualist. They almost never look at the whole picture. And it's a pity because the whole picture tells you that you cannot grow things infinitely, in an infinite way. So you will never save the climate by adding net zero pledges from people that just look at their own universe, you know? For example, I don't know, the aviation sector pledged to neutralize its carbon footprint by buying sustainable aviation fuel, which means like biofuel. So you need to make things grow and make it biokerosene. But on the other hand, they also pledged to grow forests. And then you have the British Airways that has itself a plan to grow forests. And then you have this bank that wants to grow forests, Microsoft that wants to grow lots of forests. And in the end, when you sum everyone's plans, you realize that you need to have maybe 20 planets of forests to achieve these goals. This means that all these companies have failed getting to setting a target that is robust enough in terms of emissions reductions. So it's really a pity, and it's, I think, a huge problem with, the pledges from the private sector. What they need to understand is that it's cool to grow forests, of course, as long as you take care of them in the long run and make these carbon sinks permanent. But the really big priority is to cut emissions.
Okay. Can you tell us about something that makes you optimistic or makes you want to keep fighting?
I think what keeps me optimistic is 2 things. One, young generations that are more incredible than ever. I think we're still young, but like the younger generations are amazing and doing an amazing job in telling the truth and telling grown-ups at their face that they're doing a terrible thing and that they don't trust them and so on. So it's, I think, really beautiful, but I don't like this answer only because it's like, just take care of it, young boys and girls, and so I don't really like that. But it gives me hope because it seems like a really good shift in terms of mindset and so on. The second thing that keeps me alive is that we have so much to do in order to struggle and to fight to get to to get to real action and to denounce the greenwashing. I mean, there is so much to do and so much to say to fight these corporate guys and girls that just want to have a business as usual. So I think we really have a role to play in denouncing and fighting. It's like Camus, Mythe de Sisyphe. It's like we live in a really absurd world. We are in a lonely planet that's going circles around a star that's just a fusion, thermodynamic fusion. There is no explanation of anything. We do not know what we do in this planet, okay? But in order to fight that, the political action and political involvement is what Camus says is one of the things that could solve and save us, actually. And I think it applies very well for climate change, for the fight of climate change. I mean, we're in a desperate situation, and in order not to become completely desperate, is to understand that we can still act and do really good things together.